Okay. Once again, like every class, I am telling you that please, there will be things that are new, and I am taking up this topic in the undergraduate level for the first time. Okay, so please, if you do not understand any portion, do not hesitate to pause me and ask the question. Do not keep any doubts, okay, because this is a very very important conceptual topic that we are going to start today. Extremely important. Okay, quantum mechanics is the base that has its own importance, and applications of quantum mechanics have their own importance, but this, we cannot call this really a an application of quantum mechanics, but we will be using things that are consequences of quantum mechanical treatment. Okay, so this, it's by itself, this is a very very important topic. Okay, so please don't hesitate to stop me and ask me questions, and I will go slowly because this is the last topic that I have left to complete my syllabus. So even if we don't finish in our next class, we can take another class to finish it off, but we will not hurry, we will not go in a rush. Okay, so this is basically, I have just copied exactly from the CU syllabus, CU CBCS syllabus. This is the portion 4.3.1, and this is the heading number 7, atoms in electric and magnetic fields. So basically we will try to observe what happens when an atom is placed in an external electric or magnetic field. Okay, as I told you, I will first try to introduce to you certain things that you have not probably encountered beforehand, and then we will go to the actual placement of the atom in an external field. Okay. Now, you are currently doing hydrogen atom problem, and you know that hydrogen atom is a single electron atom, but that is the only single electron atom. All the rest of the atoms in the universe are multi-electron. Okay, so we have to think about description of electron behavior in multi-electron atoms. In hydrogen atom, we are at peace because we have only a single electron to deal with, and by using the uh, remember the combined mass problem, we just take the nucleus to be a stationary object around which the electron is moving. So a two-body problem is basically reduced to a one-body problem by using the reduced mass formula. And then you do the you solve the Schrodinger equation by separation of variable, etc., and get all the quantum numbers by solving each the radial equation, the azimuthal equation, and the polar equation. But now we have to think about describing an electron behavior in multi-electron atoms, in atoms which have more than one electron. Okay. So this is done by succession of increasingly accurate approximations. Okay. So just, you know, the straightforward use of Schrodinger equation is not enough to describe the behavior of electrons in multi-electron atoms. So what we usually do is we uh, try to solve the problem by using successively increasing accurate approximation. So we start by the most minimum approximation and then slowly go to more and more accurate approximations. Okay, so the first step is that we take only the strongest interactions felt by the atomic electrons. Okay, so we decide that what are the strongest effects on the atomic electrons that are moving around the nucleus. That interaction we take as the first step. Okay, and this is known as the Hartree approximation. We will not do all this because multi-electron atoms as a whole is not there in our syllabus, but we just need to know that The first approximation is to take the strongest interactions felt by the electrons, and this first approximation is known as the Hartree approximation. What is done here? We take each electron as if it were moving independently in a spherically symmetric potential. So we still consider the potential to be spherically symmetric, and we describe the average Coulomb interaction with the nucleus and the other electrons. So have you understood the picture? Suppose there are 4 electrons in an atom. Okay, so we take one electron as an individual, consider its Coulomb interaction with the nucleus and with the other 3 electrons. Okay, then we take the second electron, consider its Coulomb interaction with the nucleus and the other 3 electrons. So for a single electron, the resultant of the Coulomb interaction with the nucleus and with the 3 other electrons will give its the interaction of that particular electron, and we treat each such electron individually and independently, and we take the general potential to be spherically symmetric. Okay, so this is the first step. What are the next steps? In the next step, we describe we take into account the more weaker interactions that the electrons feel. When an electron is moving in an atom, it is not only interacting with the nucleus and the other electrons, but it has other atoms, neighboring atoms, their nuclei, their electrons to interact with. Okay, so the description is made more accurate step by one taking into account the successive weaker interactions that the electrons feel. Now, out of these successive interactions, there are 2 main ones that involve departure of the actual Coulomb interaction experienced by an atomic electron from the average described by the net potential. Okay, so here you see in the Hartree approximation, we take the average Coulomb interaction of a single electron with other electrons and the nucleus. Now, when we take the successive weaker interactions into account, there are 2 which involve departure from the actual Coulomb interactions. Okay, what are they? Out of these 2 departures, one leads to coupling between the orbital angular momenta of the electrons. All the electrons are moving around the nucleus. So all of them have individual orbital angular momentum. Each electron has its own orbital angular momentum because of its motion in an orbit around the nucleus. Okay, so there will be an interaction between the orbital angular momenta of all the electrons that are moving together, moving around the nucleus. Okay, so this coupling is one. And the other coupling is between the spin angular momentum of the nucleus. An electron, you know, is spinning on its own axis. It is not just moving around the nucleus, it is also spinning on its own axis. So here we still maintain the similarity of the atom with the solar system model. In the solar system model, all of you know that a planet spins on its own orbit as well as spins on its own axis as well as revolves around the sun on an orbit, on an elliptical orbit. Exactly in the same manner, in an atom, an electron spins on its own axis as well as revolves on an orbit around the nucleus. There are dissimilarities, all of you know that. You are old enough to know the dissimilarities between the atomic model and the solar system. But this is one similarity about the revolving electrons, that they have dual motion, spin and orbital revolution. So these are 2 couplings, one between the orbital angular momenta of all the electrons, interaction between them, and 2, since each electron has its own spin, so each electron will have their own spin angular momentum and the coupling between the spin angular momenta of the electrons. Okay. These are two. The third is a weaker interaction which involves the internal magnetic fields of an atom. What are internal magnetic fields? Now we know that the electron is a charged particle. So when it spins, basically we have a moving charge. When it moves around the nucleus on an orbit, we again have a charge that is moving. And any moving charge involves a current. And any current involves a magnetic field. Okay. So inside an atom, there are internal magnetic fields due to these charged particles. So the third weaker interaction involves the internal magnetic fields of the atom. This leads to the coupling between spin and orbital angular momentum. So the first two were, this is orbital angular momentum with orbital angular momentum. This is spin angular momentum with spin angular momentum. The third is coupling between spin angular momentum and orbital angular momentum of the different electron. And the fourth is a still weaker interaction when the atom is placed in an external magnetic field. We can see that the atom itself inside it has orbital angular momenta, spin angular momentum, internal magnetic field and couplings between these angular momenta. So when it is placed in an external magnetic field, obviously that magnetic field will affect this configuration of the atom. Okay, so this effect, when the atom is placed in an external magnetic field, that leads to Zeeman effect. So you can understand that in order to properly understand Zeeman effect, you have to have a fair idea of these, how the different angular momenta of the electron behave inside an atom, and how the couplings occur and what is the result of this coupling, of these couplings. Only when you have a fair idea of this, only then can you really understand how the external field is affecting the electrons in the atom, so that we get to see an effect like the Zeeman effect. Okay, so there is no point in directly going to, defining and going to Zeeman effect like that. It is better that we first have a fair idea, a clear idea of all this, so that when we ultimately do Zeeman effect, we don't have any confusion. Okay, do you have any questions from this slide?
No, no.
Okay, then let's move on. Now let me ask you this question. When is an atom raised from its ground state? We know all atoms are usually in their ground state. What causes an atom to, go to states, to higher excited state from its ground state? Can someone unmute and tell me? This is a very, general knowledge question. By now you should know this. Someone want to tell me?
when some when some energy is given from outside to the atom.
Right, exactly, very good. When we give some in some manner, we if we are able to give some energy from outside to the atom, then it will be raised from its ground state, right? Now, so basically, usually what happens is an outer subshell electron will gain energy and it will go to a low energy excited state. We have filled shells. So when an outer, now by now you should know from your high school chemistry, you have done Hund's rule and all. So you know that each atomic orbit has further subshells, SPDF. I hope you know that the K, L, M, N, these are the orbit names, and each orbit has further subshells. Each orbit has the S, P, D, F subshells. Okay, so what happens is when an outer subshell electrons is given energy, it goes to a low energy excited state. Okay. For example, in a gas chamber, in a gas discharge tube, I mean, when one atom collides with another, then some energy is transferred. Okay. So what exactly happens? The Coulomb field of the incident atom will give few electron volts of excitation energy to an outer subshell electron of the struck atom. We know that the outer subshell electrons are most, the least bound to the nucleus. The binding force of the nucleus decreases as we move away from the nucleus. So the outermost subshell electrons are least bound to the electrons, and it is most easiest to dislodge an electron from this outermost subshell. So when an atom strikes another one during their collision inside a, say, for example, gas discharge tube, then energy is a few electron volts, not very high energy, a few electron volts, because all the atoms are more or less moving with the same energy inside the discharge tube. So when one strikes the other, it's not that a large amount of energy will be given. So a few electron volts of energy is given, but that energy is utilized by an outer subshell electron of the struck atom. Okay. Now during the de-excitation process, the atom that was struck, outer subshell electron of this struck atom, that went to a higher excited state of low energy. So when it gets de-excited, okay, then what happens? It goes down to its ground state by emitting a set of low energy photons. All this you know perfectly. This is just recapitulation. So when it emits a low energy photon, the line that is produced, okay, that is called the optical line spectrum. Clear? So when, and this must be very clear too, when an outer subshell electron is given a small amount of excitation energy, it will go to a low energy excited state, and when it comes back from this low energy excited state to its original ground state, then it will emit, the excess energy will be emitted in the form of a low energy photon and will constitute the optical line spectrum. So the entire affair is low energy. Okay. This kind of initial excitation is therefore called optical excitation. Okay. What does it involve? Giving small amount of energy to outer shell electrons. You must remember that this is in contrast to the phenomenon where X-ray excitation takes place. You know, you have also seen Bremsstrahlung where X-ray excitation takes place. In X-ray excitation, it involves, when is an X-ray emitted? If you remember your the chapter on X-ray, I don't know, although if you have done it or not. Okay, so just know that when X-ray is emitted, what happens? It involves transferring a very large amount of energy to an electron in an inner subshell. Inner subshell electrons which are closer to the nucleus, are very tightly bound to the nucleus. The binding energy is very high. So to dislodge an inner subshell electron, a very large amount of excitation energy has to be given. Okay, so when that happens, we get an X-ray as a result. So that is different from optical excitation. So X-ray excitation is different from optical excitation. X-ray, this is just for your knowledge, just so that you can, you know in your heads that there are two kinds of excitation that can take place. So X-ray excitation involves giving large amount of energy to inner subshell electrons, whereas optical excitation, which we will be discussing for the time being, involves giving small amount of energy to outer subshell electron. Okay. Now, for the simplest case of them, so there are so many atoms in the period. If you remember your periodic table, there are so many elements, so many atoms, and I mean, when you go to the higher cells of the periodic table, the number of electrons is huge. Okay, so we will not go into the complications, although there everything has been studied, all the spectrum of most of the elements have been studied, but we will just keep our discussion simple because we are just starting off with this. So the simplest case of such optical excitation is for alkali atoms. Okay. So now our next level of discussion will be about alkali atoms and what are alkali atoms. Okay. Do you remember what are alkali? I mean, which elements are alkali elements? नाम बोलते पारबे? How good is your chemistry? Alkali elements. Hey, alkali elements you don't remember? None of you? Don't remember? Say yes or no at least.
Ma'am, sodium, potassium.
Yes, sodium, potassium, lithium. Yes.
Lithium.
Yeah. I did not remember. I remembered only, my chemistry is very, very bad. I remembered only while preparing your slides. Okay. So the group of atomic systems which are somewhat more complex than hydrogen-like systems, but with striking similarity to a hydrogen spectrum. Okay. So this group of elements or atoms of these elements are called the alkali atoms. Okay. Group of atomic systems which are only slightly more complex than hydrogen. We know that the simplest atomic system is the hydrogen atom. Okay, which is why we are solving the hydrogen atom problem in quantum mechanics application. You are doing it. So, by the way, if you want, I have a hydrogen atom document, like a note prepared, which I did for the 5th semesters last year. If you want, I can send you that note. So just inform me in the WhatsApp group if you want it, then I can send it to you. Okay. So these alkali atoms, they are just slightly more complex than the hydrogen atom, and therefore the spectra of alkali atoms is strikingly similar to that of hydrogen atoms. Okay, why? That we'll see very soon. Now in the ground states, the atoms contain a set of completely filled subshells. Okay, when these atoms are in the ground state, the subshells are completely filled, and the highest energy subshell is the p subshell. Okay, SPDF. So whichever orbital you are in, when they are in the ground state, the highest filled subshell is the p subshell. Okay, so suppose you are in the k orbital, and so the highest filled subshell is the p subshell of the k orbital. So which will be the next higher energy subshell? If you are in the k orbital, k has SPDF, then L will also have its SPDF. So if you are, suppose in the ground state, we are dealing with an atom whose highest energy electron is whose highest filled subshell is the p subshell of the k orbital. So what will be the next higher orbital, next higher subshell in the L orbital? Tell me.
S হবে.
S orbital. S orbital. Okay. So the highest energy subshell is the p subshell plus a single additional electron in the next S subshell. Okay. So this is the configuration of the alkali atom. completely filled subshells, highest energy subshell is the p subshell, and it has a single additional electron in the next s subshell. Okay. So the energy of the electrons in the filled p subshell is more negative than the energy of an electron in the next s subshell. So the p subshell electrons are not excited in any low energy process, therefore thereby leading to the production of optical spectra. So the only electron that may be excited in an optical process, by an optical excitation process, is the single lone electron that is sitting in the s subshell. Clear? So I'll show you the picture so that it will be clear. So basically an alkali atom in essence consists of an inert noble gas core, you know, the inner core, plus a single electron moving in an external subshell. So basically the excited states can be completely described by describing this single optically active electron. The total energy of the core does not change, and the total energy of the atom is some constant plus total energy of the optically active electron. Okay. So when we are talking about alkali atoms, I'll just repeat what I said. When we are talking about alkali atoms, the highest subshell is a p subshell, plus there is a single additional electron in the next s subshells. So obviously the energy of the electrons in the filled p subshells, they are closer to the nucleus, so that is more negative than the energy of the single electron in the next s subshell. So it is easier to, you know, excite the this single s subshell electron when small amount of excitation energy is given, and we just saw that small amount of excitation energy is called optical excitation. So optical excitation cannot in any way affect the electrons in the p subshells. Okay. So basically an alkali atom can be pictured, can be visualized as having a core which is like an inert noble gas plus a single electron moving in an external subshell. So the excited states, to describe the excited states, we can forget about the inert gas core and deal with only the single optically active electron. And the total energy of, now the total energy of the core will not change because it consists of the nucleus and the electrons that are there up to the p subshell of that core, and that since we are not being able to dislodge the electrons from this core, so the energy of the core remains constant. So the total energy of the atom will be this constant value plus energy of the optically active electron. Okay, so when you give small amount of energy, when you are subjecting such alkali atoms to optical excitation, we can safely deal only with this outer lone electron. Okay. Example is, as you told me just now, lithium, sodium, potassium, etc. Now, in the alkali atoms, the lines in a particular series have regular decreasing separation and converge towards a limit. As you know that in hydrogen atom, we know that the energy levels, they decrease as you go to higher shells, okay, and converge towards a limit. That is what we obtain from a quantum mechanical treatment. Similar thing happens in alkali atoms. The wave numbers of the spectral lines can be expressed by the differences between two term series. These are called term series. You don't have to bother much about this. This is just, you know, for you to understand what comes next. This nu bar is the wave number, and this T of n is called a term series. And in order to know the the wave number when a de-excitation takes place and we get a particular optical line in the spectrum, we just need to know that this may be expressed by the difference of these two terms. Okay. Now only difference from hydrogen atom, when you come to the final energy expression of hydrogen atom, you will see that it depends only on the principal quantum number, and both the terms are constants for a given de-excitation process. In this case, however, we have only one term to be a constant and the other will be a running term. Okay, so this is how we describe a particular term series: r by n minus delta whole square, or r by n star square, where r is called the Rydberg constant. When you come to the end of hydrogen atom, you will know what a Rydberg constant is. It is just a constant that has a certain expression, but it is a universal constant value. Okay, n is the principal quantum number. I hope all of you know what is n by now. Delta is called the quantum defect. I'll tell you what quantum defect is just now. And n star is n minus delta. We call it an effective quantum number. Now delta is a number which is between 0 and 1. So it is less than 1. So when you have n star equal to n minus delta, obviously it is no longer an integer. It is the effective quantum number. In hydrogen atom, the term series is just r by n square. For a given nth orbital, the term series is just r by n square. Whereas in the alkali atoms, we have to replace n by n star because of this quantum defect. Now, what is the origin of this quantum defect? Why do we have to deal with a quantum defect in case of alkali atoms? The optical or valence electron of the alkali atoms can be easily removed to leave behind a positive ion with the same number of electrons as that of the preceding inert gas atom that is chemically stable. So since I told you in the last slide that an alkali atom consists of an inert gas core plus one single optically active electron revolving in the next, immediately next S subshell. So this electron can be easily removed. Now when this electron is removed, what are we left with? We are left with a positive ion. If you remove one electron from a neutral atom, you are left with a positive ion. Now this positive ion has the same number of electrons as that of the preceding inert gas. So if you are talking about lithium and you take out the lone optically active electron from lithium, then you will be left with the lithium plus ion, but the number of electrons in the lithium plus ion is the same as that of helium, where helium is the immediately preceding inert gas for lithium. Okay, and it is chemically stable. So the model of an alkali atom is like this: a nucleus with charge plus Ze. Z is the atomic number. So this is the nucleus with charge Ze. There are Z number of protons. Surrounded by a stable core of Z minus 1 electrons. Nucleus has Z protons. Surrounding this, we have a stable core of having Z minus 1 electrons. This is the stable core with configuration of inert gas. Okay, so this is the stable core with Z minus 1 electrons. And we have a valence electron revolving around this core. Okay, so this part is the core, and this electron that moves in the next S subshell is the optically active or the valence electron. You know that the electron that can be removed easily from the atom is usually called the valence electron, because that is the electron that will interact. And for alkali atoms, the valence is always 1. So this is why, okay, because we have the stable core with the optically active electron outside. Okay, so this is the model of an alkali atom. Now this electron core with Z minus 1 electron, basically what happens is, if you look properly, this core essentially screens the nucleus from the outermost electron. Like, you know, the nucleus is a very strong, stable part of the atom, and the core will screen the nucleus from the outer this optically active electron.
দুধ পেয়েছে মুছে দিয়েছি হ্যাঁ দুধ পেয়েছে মুছে গেছে
Okay, so it is as if this electron does not have to deal with the nucleus. Nucleus is being dealt with by this core with Z-1 electron, and this electron is free. Okay, its elder brothers and sisters are shielding it from the parent, and it is kind of a rogue. It travels alone, stays alone, and it can be easily snatched from the family. So the electron core is effectively screening the nucleus from the outermost electron. So this electron experiences an effective nuclear charge Z prime E. It does not face the entire nuclear charge of Ze. What is Z prime E? Z prime E is Ze minus Z minus 1E, which is just plus E. Z minus 1 electrons here are dealing with the Z protons of the nucleus. So the effective nuclear charge that this lone electron has to deal with is just 1. Is this clear to you? Is this picture clear? Or do you want me to repeat this once again?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You want me to repeat, or is it okay?
No, ma'am, okay.
Okay. I mean, it's very easy to understand. At least I've tried to make it easy, I hope. Okay. So this is the same as in case of hydrogen atom, where Z equal to 1. Hydrogen atom has a single proton nucleus, right? So the charge that the nuclear charge that the electron, valence electron of the hydrogen atom has to place is plus E. So here also the optically active electron, the valence electron, is facing a nuclear charge which is just plus E. Effective nuclear charge for it is just plus E, right? This is the reason why the spectra of alkali atoms and hydrogen atom are similar. And this is the same for all alkali atoms. We were just talking about lithium, but lithium is a small atomic number atom. Even if you go to higher atomic number alkali atoms, the same thing happens, because the model is, after all this, you have the nucleus surrounded by the core with Z-1 electrons, and whatever that Z or Z-1 be, the value of Z or Z-1, outside that you have just one lone optically active electron. And since the core is shielding the nucleus to a large extent from this optically active electron, the amount of effective nuclear charge that this electron faces is always just plus E, which is the same as in case of hydrogen atom, and which is why the spectra of alkali atoms is so similar to that of hydrogen atom. So the energy of the valence electron, ENL, should be Rz prime by n square instead of Rz by n square, minus in front, which is minus R by n square. Since Z prime is 1, we just saw effective nuclear charge is 1. Okay, so this is the effective energy of the valence electron, which is the same as hydrogen atom. So the atomic number doesn't appear in the term value when you are dealing with just the outer shell electron, that is the optically active electron. However, now you have to think about the real picture. This is an ideal picture that I spoke about. You have to keep in mind that the electron is not actually moving in an exactly circular orbit, but the orbit is elliptical with the nucleus at one of its foci. Okay, so when the electron is moving, it is moving in an elliptical orbit, just like the planets of our solar system, and the sun is at the one of the an ellipse has two foci, so the sun will be at one of the foci of this ellipse. Okay, similarly here, when the electron is moving in this outer shell electron, when it is moving in an elliptical orbit, the nucleus will be at one of its foci. Okay, so if this is the core and the nucleus, then the actual orbit, unlike this very good looking orbit and this orbit which makes our life simple, the actual orbit is like this with the electron at one of the foci. So now what is the complication? What do we have to deal with now? So the distance of the electron from the nucleus is variable. When we consider a circular orbit, the distance of the electron from the nucleus is always the same. But when we consider the elliptical orbit, the distance of the electron from the nucleus is variable. It is either at the apogee or at the perigee. Do you remember apogee and perigee? When it is nearest or furthest from the foci, from the focus at which the sun is. Remember apogee,
Yes, ma'am.
aphelion and perihelion of planets. Similarly over here. So its distance is variable, and the electron might sometimes penetrate the core. It is not this lovey-dovey picture all the time. The electron may sometimes penetrate the core. Such penetration will make the screening of the nuclear charge by the core less effective. So this complete screening does not happen in reality. When it is penetrating the core, then this complete screening is not happening anymore. Okay, so the mean effective nuclear charge Z double prime, we considered it to be Z prime with complete shielding by the core. So now we have to consider the mean effective nuclear charge, not just the effective nuclear charge, which is Z double prime is therefore greater than the effective nuclear charge Z prime outside the core. Okay. So the reduced energy of the valence electron is not just minus Rz prime by n square, it is minus Rz prime by n whole square, which is equal to minus R. What is Z double prime? Z double prime is Z prime by n minus delta, okay, whole square. This is equal to minus R by n minus delta whole square, because Z prime is 1. Z prime is 1, we have no doubt about that. So when we write the mean effective nuclear charge Z double prime in terms of Z prime, now we can write the energy to be minus R by n minus delta whole square, where delta is called the quantum defect. Okay, the value of this quantum defect depends on the orbital quantum number L. It is also sometimes called orbital angular momentum quantum number, or in short orbital quantum number L. Remember L that we get from solving the azimuthal equation of the hydrogen atom problem, the orbital quantum number. We obtain the orbital quantum number when we solve the azimuthal equation of the hydrogen atom problem. So as I told you, these are not direct applications of Schrodinger equation, but we will be taking results from the consequences of quantum mechanics applied on hydrogen atom to these problems. Okay, so this result of the energy value that we get in the term expression has, instead of n in the denominator, which is the simpler case of hydrogen atom, instead of n we have to write n minus delta. Okay, and this is the cause of this quantum defect. Delta is called the quantum defect. And as I told you just now that the quantum defect depends on the orbital quantum number L. How does it depend? It is greatest for orbits with maximum eccentricity, that is smallest L. You know what is the eccentricity of an ellipse? So orbits with maximum eccentricity will have the greatest value of delta, and orbits with maximum eccentricity are actually the orbitals with the smallest values of L. For these, the average effective nuclear charge Z double prime E will be maximum. Spelling mistake here. Okay. So the maximum delta values are obtained for the orbits with maximum eccentricity and thereby minimum L. The lowest energy state therefore will have the greatest quantum defect. Obviously, the closer you are to the nucleus, the more you are prone to penetrating the core and the more quantum defect you will face. The closer the orbit is to the nucleus, it is more prone to penetration of the core, and therefore the screening will be less effective, and therefore in turn the mean effective nuclear charge will be more. So the lowest energy state will have the greatest quantum defect. So this is basically a table showing us what are the values of the quantum defect and the orbital angular momenta for the SPDF subshells of a given orbital. So whichever orbital you are in, whether it be the K shell or the L shell or M shell or N shell, etc., within it we have the SPDF subshells, and the value of the quantum defect is like this. For the S, if we call it delta naught, it is greater than delta 1, which is the quantum defect for P, which is greater than delta 2, which is the quantum defect for D, and which is greater than delta 3, which is the quantum defect for F. This greater than value will not be here. So, and we know the corresponding angular, the orbital quantum number, orbital angular momentum quantum number L are these values 0, 1, 2, 3. So you can see that for 0, quantum defect is highest, which is the closest to the nucleus, and as L increases, quantum defect decreases. Okay, so this is the scenario in an alkali atom. So L decides the energies of the sublevels of equal principal quantum number N. Okay, so this is, as I told you, for a given shell of principal quantum number N, we have different subshells SPDF with different L values. Depending on the L values, we have different quantum defect values for each subshell, and therefore the energy value will also be different, because we saw just now that the energy of the electron is in the subshell is given by R by N minus delta whole square. So with changing delta values, even if you are in the same orbital, the N value will not change. But for different subshells, the L value will change, which in turn will change the delta value, and therefore effectively R Rydberg constant divided by N minus delta whole square will change. So indirectly, L is deciding the energies of the sublevels with the same principal quantum number N. Okay. So here we have, I have taken this from the internet. This shows the energy levels of lithium atom and the possible transitions. Now these, which transitions are possible, how the Hund's rule acts over here, how do we get the selection rules, etc. That I will not discuss, because that is a part of atomic spectrum, atomic spectroscopy, that you will learn in a separate module. So I will not spend so much time, but just I want to show you what I just discussed. First of all S terms with L equal to 0 are grouped in one vertical column. See, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s. These are all the s terms of the different orbitals. So L equal to 0 giving us the s subshells are all grouped in one vertical column. Similarly, all the p subshells for the different orbitals 2p, 3p, 4p, 5p, etc. are grouped in one vertical column. Similarly, all the d orbitals, okay, and so on. Selection rule, you will learn how the selection rule is obtained when you do it in atomic spectroscopy. In this particular case, the selection rule is given by delta L equal to plus minus 1. What is selection rule? Selection rule decides which quantum jumps are allowed and which are not allowed. Just because there are so many energy levels, it doesn't mean that an electron can go from any lower level to any upper level. That is not allowed. Which transitions are allowed are given by the selection rule. And when this selection rule is applied, we see that the allowed transitions are these: S to P, P to S, P to D, etc. And these transitions, 2s to 3s, 2p to 3p, 3s to 3p, etc., these are not allowed. So although we have, by analyzing the atom and putting the quantum numbers, we get so many subshells, but we must remember that the selection rule does not allow all transitions, and therefore the spectral lines that we actually observe are much less than which could be there. If there was no selection rule, then all transitions would be allowed. So electron could go from any lower state to any higher state and come back. But that is not allowed, and hence the actual number of spectral lines that are observed are much less. Now as I told you, that this is a field of intense and vigorous study where you just learn how these levels are created and how these transitions take place. You actually get questions in your exam where you have to find out what are the allowed transitions. But we will not discuss that here. That is not our topic of discussion. What we are interested here is in the fact that we saw that each spectral line in any series of the alkali spectra is a singlet. Singlet means just single lines. See, from any one state to the next, for example, from 3s to 2p, we have only one line. From 4s to 2p, we have only one line. From 5p to 2s, we have only one line. So between any two states, we have only one line, that is a singlet. But actually, observation shows that these should be doublets, not singlets. Okay? The origin of doublets is explainable only on inclusion of electron spin. So till now we saw how the orbital motion of the electron was described and how the angular momentum orbital angular momentum quantum number L decides the energy of a subshell of a given principal quantum number, and therefore how the delta L equal to plus minus 1 decides the different transitions. But observation shows, minute, highly precise observation shows that these transition lines are not singlets but they are doublets, and the doublets can be explained only if we include electron spin. So we were dealing with the orbital motion till now. Now we have to also include electron spin. Hence, we have to introduce the vector atom model. The atom model that we have been studying so long, nucleus, core, electron in the outer shell, that is not sufficient to describe the transition spectra. We have to study the vector atom model in order that we properly understand the spectra. Okay? In the vector atom model, we have to have an idea of space quantization and the hypothesis of a spinning electron. I'll tell you each one by one. I'll end today's class in this slide. There are a lot more things which we will continue. As I told you that I want to go slow because I want you to perceive these things very well. These are extremely important concepts, and these concepts will, I mean, they should stay with you if you want to pursue physics, okay? Especially high energy physics. I remember in my NET examination, the written examination of NET, all of you I hope know the NET examination, national eligibility test that you have to give to, you know, do PhD through CSIR or UGC. In that examination, I remember this exact vector atom model, selection rule, these things that are, you know, the part of this particular lecture that I'm telling you. I remember answering questions from this this part. So these are very important concepts. Okay, so we have to have idea of space quantization and hypothesis of spinning electron. What is space quantization? This was given by Summerfield entirely to interpret the splitting of spectral lines in an external magnetic field, that is Zeeman effect. So we will elaborately do Zeeman effect, but just remember the space quantization was introduced to explain Zeeman effect. According to this model, continuous positions of orbits in space are not allowed. Till now, we had talked about the fact that electrons can't stay in between two orbits. Electrons are allowed to stay only in specified orbits, right? But there was no restriction to the orientation of orbits. Orbits could be oriented in any direction, placed in any manner around the nucleus. Space quantization says that continuous manifold positions of orbits in space is not allowed. Orbits are quantized not only in magnitude but also in direction or spatial orientation. There is not only magnitude. If you remember the Bohr model, the orbits can have only those distances at which the magnitude of the electron is mvr equal to nh cut. Remember Bohr model, that electrons are not allowed to stay in between. These are allowed orbits, these are forbidden gaps. But there was no restriction on the spatial orientation of the orbits. Now space quantization says that not only the magnitude but also direction or orientation of the orbits are quantized. So we have to identify the orbits as vector quantities. Their directions become important. So now in the vector atom model, we will treat the orbits as vector quantities. For spatial quantization, the reference direction is necessary. If you want to, you know, say that the orbit is directed along a particular direction, it has to be with reference to something else. We can't set up a coordinate system just randomly. We have to have a reference, right? So the reference is served by the external magnetic field, which is why Zeeman effect was an ideal phenomena to give us the concept of space quantization, because there the splitting happens because of the external magnetic field. However, the moment you keep the atom in an external magnetic field, the external field will perturb the orbits, will interfere with the orbits and deform their shapes. So what do? We assume that the external field is very small in magnitude, tends to 0. So that will minimize their perturbation but maintain the direction. Magnitude is small doesn't mean it doesn't have a direction. Direction is still there. So the direction will give us the orientation of the orbit, but very small magnitude allows us to, you know, neglect the perturbation that might be caused by the external field. So the projection of the quantized orbits on the fields themselves must also be quantized. Remember this. When you take an orbit to be a vector quantity, what do? You take its projection, the cos theta component, on the field. But we have to remember that this component is also quantized. Okay. This is the permitted orientation. So this is space quantization. After this, we'll have to do we'll have to discuss the concept of the spinning electron. But I think too much has been already done for today. So we'll continue with this discussion in our next class, next Friday. Please, as I tell you always, I am telling you now also, please go through the slides. If required, go through the recorded version and see that you have understood each and every part properly. It is very important that you understand these concepts. A sketchy idea will only lead to further sketchy ideas, and it is very difficult if you have to learn these things by rote. Okay, so please go through the slides and see if you are understanding these. If you have any doubt, then please don't hesitate to tell me in the next class. We will first clear the doubts. If required, I'll take, if I don't know when our session ends, but don't worry about the syllabus, I'll end it, but don't keep any you know shadowy concepts in this field. It becomes very difficult later on.